It may have been the greatest army of all time, conquering and controlling an empire that stretched across the ancient Western world. It was ruthless, disciplined, and feared by all, not just by its enemies, who died in their millions, but by its own emperors, who often paid the price of the army's wrath. And yet, these soldiers were builders as well as destroyers, helping to spread a culture that became the bedrock of Western civilization. What was it that made this army so dominant? How was it able to rule and reshape the classical world? And why did it eventually fall? This is the story of the Roman war machine. The glory that was Rome was built largely upon the power of its army. Until it discovered how to wage war, Rome was just another small Italian farming settlement. But there was something different about the Romans. They had a unique ability to turn themselves into a political and military power without equal. The city that would dominate the ancient world for centuries began as early as 1000 BC. Archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings from that period on Rome's Palatine Hill, where many centuries later, the Roman emperors built their palaces. Early Rome was dominated by a neighbor, the Etruscans, from what is now Tuscany to the north. Etruscan kings took control of Rome around 600 BC and ruled it for a century before the Romans expelled them. Rome then began creating the political and military system we recognize today. Rome became a republic with a Senate and two chief executives, the consuls, who were elected for one-year terms to handle important matters, including the military. Rome had to learn how to fight because it occupied an important trading crossroads on the Tiber River, and it was always skirmishing with envious neighbors. As early as 500 BC, Rome had an army of 6,000 men called a legion, from the Latin word meaning conscription. But this was a far cry from the professional Roman army that would later dominate the world.
They are citizen soldiers, they are part-time soldiers, they get recruited for the campaigning season. They leave their fields, their work, to go off and fight in the army. At the end of the campaign, they're back, bringing in the harvest, bringing in the vintage, plowing the fields.
Every year, able-bodied Roman men were summoned by trumpet to report for enlistment. But not all men. Only landowners were trusted to fight for Rome because they had something to protect. Service was regarded as a duty and an honor, and a must for any Roman seeking political power.
The Roman people are reluctant to vote for people who cannot show their war wounds. There are many stories of people standing for politics in the forum, ripping their clothes to show their wounds, to demonstrate that they have fought for Rome in battle.
Romans had to provide their own armor and weapons, so the wealthiest, the officers, had a helmet, armor, a spear, a sword, and a shield, while the poorest, the front ranks, had no armor and had only slings and stones for weapons. The early Roman army was modeled on the Greeks, especially the basic tactical formation. The Greek army used the so-called phalanx, a tight-knit, rolling infantry formation which came at the enemy like a forest of spears.
Your whole army lined up, facing forward in lines, and then the first few ranks would hold out their spears and their shields, and the army would move forward en masse. The object was to simply push aside the enemy, and to simply move forward en masse. The object was to simply push aside the enemy and in the course of it, kill as many as possible.
Rome's first major victory was against its old nemesis, the Etruscans, when Rome conquered the nearby city of Veii in 396 BC. But the Romans didn't have long to celebrate. 6 years later, they met an entirely new kind of enemy, when Celtic warriors from the north swept down upon Rome. The Celts were a people linked by language, culture, and style of warfare. And Celtic tribes were spread across Europe, from Ireland to France and Switzerland. In 390 BC, a Celtic army thrashed the Roman legion and overran Rome.
The Celtic method of fighting was very disturbing to them. The Celts simply ran at you with hundreds and thousands of men, yelling, shouting, banging on metal objects, blowing their horns. They really terrified the Romans.
The Celts left the city only after the Romans bribed them with gold. This was Rome's wake-up call. It needed to rethink its whole military strategy if it was to survive, and one way was through training. Roman soldiers had to go through the toughest training in the ancient world. There were 4 long, hard months of basic training, and anyone who couldn't stand the pace was either discharged or put on rations of foul-tasting barley until they got it right. Basic training began with marching, and plenty of it. Soldiers had to be able to march more than 20 miles in 5 hours, carrying a full pack. In weapons training, recruits were given dummy swords, shields, and javelins that weighed twice as much as the real things to build muscles.
The Romans, I think, in this early period, should really be seen as the Zulus of the Mediterranean world. They are a highly militarized society, and like the Zulus, they don't let their warriors have sex, so when they come into battle, they're very tough.
As the army grew, armor became standardized for all soldiers and provided by the state.
I'm wearing a male shirt for body protection, and you can see it's made of small individual pieces of metal which are fashioned into rings and then linked together. Its biggest advantage, of course, is to take slashing blows across and linked together. Small individual pieces of metal which are fashioned into rings and then linked together. Its biggest advantage, of course, is to take slashing blows across. Because the mail links all sit together, if an enemy hit me with a sword in a slashing way, it would actually take the blow. The disadvantage of mail was that it doesn't, in fact, take a stabbing at all. If you stab through the mail, the point of the sword will actually pierce the rings.
Beginning in the 1st century AD, the Romans also used segmented plate armor, held together by leather straps. It was so much more complicated than mail armor that soldiers needed help to put it on.
You can see all the protections on the top rather than around the legs and things. And the reason for that is that when you've got the Celts fighting you with their long slashing swords, you needed all that protection up on the top rather than the bottom. It also gives you a chance to run.
The Roman helmet, gradually redesigned over the centuries, aimed to give maximum protection without blocking the center.
All that protection up on the top rather than the bottom. It also gives you a chance to run.
The Roman helmet, gradually redesigned over the centuries, aimed to give maximum protection without blocking the senses.
You can see it's a round bowl protecting the top of my head. Round because it's got very good glancing blow action. A square helmet would take the blow, whereas a round helmet, the blow would glance off. Large cheek pieces to protect the side of my face, and a small neck guard at the back to actually take an overhand blow protecting the back of my neck. Now, obviously, you can see there's no covering on my face or on my ears, in fact. And the Romans decided that it was a lot better for a soldier to be able to see around him and hear orders, very vital in battle.
Further protection came from the Roman shield, smaller and round in early times, developing later into a bigger rectangular one. It was made of layers of wood glued together, bound, and covered with leather and metal.
The thing about the Roman shield is it's curved, not flat like most shields of the time. This gives me protection all round my body. And if I'm coming at you in battle, it's not only a defensive weapon, it's an offensive weapon. I can smash you in the face, and then while you're off balance, draw the sword and in under your ribs.
When it came to offensive weapons, the first one the Roman soldier would use in battle was the javelin.
The great thing about the Roman javelin is, when you threw it, the enemy couldn't throw it back. These are delivered in volleys of hundreds. As they rain down, the hard iron tip will punch through the armor. The weight of the handle will bend this soft metal shank. It'll be useless, you can't throw it back. Your shield is useless, you're probably hurt, you're in big trouble.
But the weapon that won the empire and kept it was the Roman sword.
Once the javelins had been expended, the Roman legion would then move in with probably the most vicious of his weapons, the short sword, or gladius in Latin. Very much a close-quarter weapon. It's much shorter than you would envisage a sort of a medieval broadsword to be, because it actually is much shorter. It's designed with a very broad base, tapering to a very, very sharp point. Now, the idea of this weapon was purely to stab. The soldier was trained to actually stab into an enemy soldier, mainly in the stomach area, because of course there's no bone for it to actually get jammed in. And of course a quick stab and withdrawal will put him out of action one way or the other. Now the soldier was trained not to use an overhand blow, but purely a stabbing action. In the modern way, a soldier uses the bayonet, really.
The thing about this Roman sword is it's shortened to the point, and it's used for stabbing rather than slashing.
The barbarians, their swords aren't like ours. They're long and broad, and it's all an ego trip on the battlefield, slashing around above their heads, all style, that's all it is.
And while they're doing that, it's up and under stabbing to the ribs, and so we make mincemeat of the barbarians.
The Roman army was ready to use their weapons and training to build an empire, and the first victims were their fellow Italians. The basic unit of the Roman army was the legion, and over time it became highly structured. Eventually, the legion evolved into a unit of 4,800 soldiers. It was divided into 10 cohorts of 480 men each, which in turn contained 6 centuries. Not 100 men, as you might expect, but 80 soldiers. Each century had 10 groups of 8 men who shared a tent. The legionary commanders were usually political appointments, Roman noblemen doing service as they climbed the political ladder. Their military ability varied greatly, and so much of the real running of the army fell to the officers beneath them. The most famous of these was the centurion, in charge of a century of soldiers. As Rome's empire grew, centurions became career soldiers, working their way up through the ranks. Centurions usually had at least 15 years' experience. It was their job to train the men, discipline them, and lead them in battle.
Because they'd seen so many campaigns, they understood the traditions of the army. They knew how the army could actually solve particular problems which you might encounter in future campaigns. So they were very much the living essence of the legions.
Well, I mean, the equipment of a Roman centurion, you can always immediately tell the centurion because his crest goes across his helmet. In this case, the crest is made of horsehair, although sometimes they were made of feathers. And if he'd been given military awards, you can see they're worn on a harness on the chest.
Centurions were career officers who took the term literally.
Centurions never had to retire. We find some cases people over 80 still serving. So this, of course, helps to secure a uniformity of standards and training and so on throughout the empire. You see careers of these centurions who've been all over the place in their very long lifetime.
Centurions could make a soldier's life hell. They demanded bribes to excuse soldiers from the less popular duties, and used their vine staffs to deliver punishment. One centurion, Lucilius, was nicknamed "Give Me Another" for his practice of breaking his staff over soldiers' backs. He was later murdered by his own men. After its early defeat by Celtic warriors in 390 BC, the Roman army changed its battle tactics. It did away with the rigid phalanx formation it had borrowed from the Greeks and used smaller fighting units called maniples or handfuls, highly maneuverable groups of less than 150 men.
This allowed the Roman army to operate more effectively, perhaps on rather rougher ground, but also it allowed them to move groups of soldiers around to the flanks and to the rear of enemy armies.
While the basis of the Roman army was its infantry, the foot soldier, each legion also had an attachment of up to 300 cavalry. The Romans were not natural horsemen, so they adapted tactics and gear from their enemies, including the Celts. One example was the military saddle.
The saddle on top of it is a very odd-looking beast to most people now. It doesn't look like a modern saddle at all. The most obvious feature are the 4 horns on it. And the 4 horns are there because of the thing that is obviously missing. There are no stirrups at all. The Romans didn't ride with stirrups. The saddle that developed after they fought with the Celts had these horns, a very significant feature. If you've got no stirrups, as I said, you can't lean out sideways very safely on a flat saddle. These horns enable you to do that. The saddle looks short compared to a modern saddle because the back horns press against your backside, the front horns go under your thigh, and you can lean out probably to about 45 degrees with relative safety.
Part of the cavalry's job was to harass the enemy, and the riders carried special light javelins for that purpose.
As you pass an enemy, you can lob several of them at them. They're not going to do a huge amount of damage, but your purpose isn't necessarily to do a lot of damage. It's to make the formation break up so that the infantry can get in and win.
In battle, the cavalry lined up on the wings of the legions. The infantry formed 3 horizontal lines, so they could take turns at being the front line until the battle was won. As the Romans formed up to start the battle, they banged their swords against their shields in a frightening drum roll until the order came to charge. As the two sides closed in on each other, the Roman front lines would launch their javelins, disrupting the enemy formation. The infantry would form wedges to break up the enemy lines and allow close-in fighting. That was when the short Roman stabbing sword would come into its own.
The fighting itself might be only 20 minutes or so. Sometimes it was a lot longer, but it was very difficult to fight for a great length of time with this massive weight of armour that Roman soldiers and often their enemies wore. Part of the reason for Roman success in battle was undoubtedly to do with training.
Once an enemy cracked, the Romans did not surround them. Instead, they usually left an easy escape route so that the cavalry could come in and cut them down as they fled. By 270 BC, Rome controlled much of the Italian peninsula. But unlike many ancient powers, it did not simply pillage its defeated neighbors, it turned them into allies, sometimes offering them Roman citizenship.
That way, as Rome expands, the people whom it conquers are integrated, form part of the Roman army, and become the troops for the next wave of conquest out. So it's a cumulative process. And that, I think, key to the success and the growth of this empire.
Rome's expansion made a clash inevitable with Carthage, another Mediterranean superpower. And when that clash came, it would produce the most horrendous war the ancient world had ever seen. Rome's expansion in the 200s BC brought it into conflict with another empire across the Mediterranean. The city of Carthage, in modern-day Tunisia, commanded an empire stretching across northern Africa. In 264 BC, Rome and Carthage began fighting over control of Sicily, where Carthage had colonies. Rome found itself at a disadvantage. Carthage had a great navy, and Rome had almost none. Rome began building one. most of its soldiers had never sailed, so they practiced on dry land, pretending to row in unison to get a feel for it. And when it came time for the real sea battles, Rome had a trick up its sleeve. It developed a kind of gangplank called a corvus that hooked onto Carthaginian ships so that the Roman soldiers could board them, turning naval battles into more familiar land battles. And that way, Rome routed the Carthaginian fleet. Rome won Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, but Carthage did not accept the defeat. In 218 BC, Carthage hit back under one of the most feared warriors Rome would ever face, Hannibal. And this time, the target was Rome itself.
Hannibal was a man clearly with tremendous determination, a great personal hatred of Rome, which he'd inherited from his family who'd fought the Romans before. And it's also very clear that he had great personal magnetism.
Hannibal marched his army through Spain and France and across the Alps into Italy, accompanied by 36 elephants.
Hatred.
Rome won Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, but Carthage did not accept the defeat. In 218 BC, Carthage hit back under one of the most feared warriors Rome would ever face, Hannibal. And this time, the target was Rome itself.
Hannibal was a man clearly with tremendous determination, a great personal hatred of Rome, which he'd inherited from his family who'd fought the Romans before. And it's also very clear that he had great personal magnetism.
Hannibal marched his army through Spain and France and across the Alps into Italy, accompanied by 36 elephants.
Most of Hannibal's elephants died on the journey over the Alps. In fact, his elephants played absolutely no role in the subsequent campaign. Nevertheless, they represent the skill and boldness that Hannibal portrayed in coming over the Alps so early in the campaigning season and surprising the Romans.
With the help of Celtic warriors who joined him on the way, Hannibal won early victories against Roman legions sent to meet him. Then, in 216 BC, came a major showdown at Cannae in southern Italy. Hannibal had about 40,000 troops, while the Romans and their allies had nearly twice that number. But Hannibal was a master tactician. When the Roman legions made their usual thrust towards his center, Hannibal let them advance, then encircled them. It was a disaster for the Roman army. Some 50,000 Romans and allies were killed. There was panic in Rome, with cries of "Hannibal is at the gates." Hannibal was never able to capture Rome, because Rome's ingenious policy of creating allies paid off once again.
What defeats Hannibal is the fact that the Romans have got 8, 9, 10 times as many men able to be pressed into the army as Hannibal has got. And they can lose 50,000 men in a day. And they keep on fighting because they've got the manpower. No other state in the ancient world could ever achieve anything like that.
Rome practiced total war against Hannibal. As an emergency measure, it called up every available man, even slaves, and sent legions to Carthage-held Spain to stop supplies and reinforcements from reaching Hannibal.
The wars on this scale are fights for survival, literally for survival. If you lose these kind of wars in the early period, your city is destroyed, your women and children are dispersed across the Mediterranean world. That's the end of it. All societies are destroyed if battles are lost.
It took 15 years of fighting before Hannibal was forced out of Italy. He returned to Carthage to defend it against a counterattack by the Romans, who finally defeated Hannibal in 202 BC. But despite the victory, Rome maintained a paranoid fear of Carthage and provoked a third war in 149 BC. It took the Roman legions 3 years to breach Carthage's huge city walls, and then the Romans slaughtered unknown thousands of Carthaginians and sold 50,000 survivors into slavery. Finally, the Romans leveled the city, plowed it into the ground, and according to legend, sowed it with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again.
Any Roman army was capable of extreme brutality, particularly in the sack of a city which had resisted them, which they then managed to break into. Under those circumstances, it seems to have been normal Roman practice, almost policy, to slaughter absolutely everybody and everything, including animals. Everybody was just chopped to pieces. It was absolute carnage.
After defeating Carthage, Rome also added Greece as a province after destroying the city of Corinth. Many other conquests followed, so that by 100 BC, Rome was undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Romans justified their expansion in a way that many modern-day politicians would understand. Rome was undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Romans justified their expansion in a way that many modern-day politicians would understand.
They always convince themselves that they fight defensive wars. No Roman war, no matter how offensive or imperialist it might look to us, to the Romans it was always a matter of defense, always fending off an attack. So in a sense, that's how they justified a Mediterranean conquest.
As rulers of a rapidly expanding empire, the legions had to get used to a lot of travel, and that meant travel on foot. When Roman soldiers marched, they carried up to 50 pounds of equipment on their backs, including weapons, armor, cooking utensils, rations, and tools for building a temporary camp. Most armies relied on natural defenses. The Romans carried the tools to build a new camp wherever they were, a new one each day, if necessary. They dug a defensive ditch around the whole camp, 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, then built a palisade with the stakes they carried with them. It was as though the Romans had their own fortified city wherever they went.
The primary purpose of a Roman marching camp is psychological rather than military. It's the idea that in enemy territory, every night you make a small city in what is not your territory. And the enemy look on, seeing their territory pockmarked by the advance of Roman armies.
The camps were a classic example of the Romans' passion for order. Every camp had an identical plan. Each leather tent was put up in the same position each time, so that the soldiers knew exactly where they were.
The soldiers had a great sense of security during the night. They knew exactly where their officers were, and the fact that their comrades were guarding them as well.
The Roman obsession with order extended to the discipline of the troops. Camp sentries who fell asleep could be stoned to death for having endangered the whole regiment.
It wasn't as exceptional as it might sound, given the general background of what Roman society was like. People were used to flogging, they were used to fairly frequent public executions. So the Roman army was indeed pretty draconian, but not as different from the rest of society as perhaps we might think.
One infamous form of harsh discipline was decimation, the killing of 1 man in 10 of regiments that showed cowardice in battle. The men were selected by lot and clubbed to death by their comrades. Roman obedience was based on fear.
If a Roman soldier was faced by a crisis in battle, that Roman soldier, that unit of soldiers, would stand their ground because they were more likely to survive a desperate fight in battle than to survive if they ran away.
One famous case of decimation came when Roman legions suffered several defeats during a revolt led by an escaped gladiator, a warrior called Spartacus. The was so busy conquering and building an empire on foreign soil that it had no standing army back home in Italy, and that left it open to surprise attack. That's just what happened in 73 BC, in a revolt led by a foreign slave named Spartacus, who'd been forced to become a gladiator.
Conditions for all slaves were relatively cruel and brutal, and particularly for gladiators who were kept chained in barracks and were brutally treated.
Spartacus led a revolt by fellow gladiators against their conditions and was soon joined in the uprising by slaves from the countryside.
Millions of slaves were brought back into Italy, and a lot of them were prisoners of war, a lot of them were ex-warriors. And therefore, although many of them were kept in barracks and many of them were trained to be gladiators, they were a potential security risk.
Because there were no legions stationed in Italy at the time, new legions had to be quickly raised and trained. But Spartacus and his men, using guerrilla tactics, defeated each legion sent to meet him, and his band remained at large in Italy for 3 years. The Roman Senate finally gave the nobleman Marcus Crassus the power to quell the revolt. To show he was serious, he began by decimating 2 of the legions that had lost to Spartacus, then raised 6 new legions and met the Spartans in open warfare.
Their tactics were so unconventional. They refused to give battle until the very end in a conventional way. They confounded the expectations of the generals and the armies sent against them. In a sense, their mistake and what lost them their final battle was to behave like Roman soldiers, to fight a conventional pitched battle. Had they stuck to guerrilla warfare, their revolt might have been even more effective than it was.
The legions defeated the rebel army and killed Spartacus, and then Crassus lined the Appian Way outside Rome with 6,000 crucified Spartans, a lesson to anyone who opposed Rome and her army. In the early days of the Roman army, soldiers were called away for only a few months at a time between spring and harvest. But the expanding empire meant long campaigns overseas, and for property owners, the only men eligible for the legions, military service became an ever-increasing hardship. By 100 BC, Rome had about 130,000 men in uniform. 1 Roman man in 8 was a soldier, and he was required to do up to 6 years of service in one stretch, and a maximum of 16 years over his lifetime. The legions needed a bigger pool of manpower to draw on, and the man who made it possible was the consul Marius, himself a great general. Twice he had saved Rome from invasion with victories over German tribes. In the fields near Aix-en-Provence in southern France in 102 BC, Marius's army killed so many Germans, 100,000 by one account, that farmers had bumper crops for years afterwards because of the blood and bones in the soil. As consul, Marius decided to throw the ranks open to all Roman citizens, whether they owned land or not. This meant poor Romans could volunteer for a secure and prestigious job with good pay and travel. They could become career soldiers. The Roman army was now on its way to becoming a full-time professional force. But volunteers still had to meet strict requirements. They had to be tall, preferably literate, and have good character references. Certain professions were preferred, including blacksmiths and hunters. Those considered not suitable included weavers and tavern keepers. New recruits had to pass an interview and a medical exam, and then had to take an oath to perform whatever they were commanded for the Roman state, and to not shrink from death. They were then given 3 gold pieces and sent to the provinces for training. But many of these new, poorer soldiers were already looking beyond 3 gold pieces. As the army kept adding new conquests, soldiers were increasingly focused on the spoils of war.
the amount of booty they were able to bring back from cities like Corinth in 146 BC was so enormous that I think it did encourage massive greed and an increasing level of brutality among Roman soldiers.
Increasingly, soldiers turned their loyalty from the Roman state to their own generals, who could make them rich. And the generals, being Roman aristocrats, saw their legions as tickets to wealth and power.
Intimately related is the general and his army. The general promises his army land, booty, settlement after the war has finished. And the army promises the general not only success in conquest, but votes back in Rome afterwards.
This led to a new class of super generals, all with political ambitions. There was Marius himself, a consul for many years. His rival Sulla, who won victories in the eastern Mediterranean and became dictator of Rome for a time. Pompey the Great, who conquered Syria and Palestine. And the most famous general of all, Julius Caesar.
Julius Caesar represents as close as I think you can get to naked ambition in the 1st century BC. There's a famous story of Julius Caesar, aged 31, in further Spain, coming across a statue of that great conqueror Alexander the Great, and suddenly bursting into tears. And his entourage say, "Why, Caesar, are you crying?" And he says, "This man, by my age, had conquered most of the world, and I have done nothing."
Within a few years, the world would know that Caesar had done a great deal. Of all Rome's great generals, none created more fame, bloodshed, loyalty, and hatred than Julius Caesar. He was a nobleman who worked his way up the political ladder and used his military command in Spain to pillage enough booty to buy votes in Rome. He was made a consul and formed a political alliance, the Triumvirate, with a rival general Pompey and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Caesar then had himself made governor of northern Italy and southern France, which made him commander of several legions. He was anxious for more conquests, and his chance soon came. In 58 BC, a Celtic people, the Helvetii, asked Caesar's permission to migrate from Switzerland to western France, across Roman allies' territory in what was then called Gaul. Instead of agreeing, Caesar decided to attack what was then called to western France, across Roman allies' territory in what was then called Gaul. Instead of agreeing, Caesar decided to attack.
Caesar, of course, is a cynic. He needs a war, he needs the booty derived from that to finance his political campaigns. Before he goes on campaign in Gaul, he is deeply in debt. Gaul will provide the booty for repaying his creditors.
Caesar sent 6 legions against the Helvetii, 360,000 men, women, and children. More than half the Helvetii were slaughtered, and the survivors forced to return to their homelands.
It was a part of the political struggle of Rome in the late Republic. Pompey, his great rival, was Rome's best general. So Caesar, competing against Pompey, he has to be a better general.
After dispatching the Helvetii, Caesar set after a German tribe that had crossed the Rhine and marched his troops 120 miles in 5 days to the Alsace region. Again, the Romans slaughtered thousands. Caesar then turned west towards Belgium and repeated the dose against the tribe there. Caesar's political foes in Rome decried his actions, but most Romans cheered him on because he was defeating Gauls, the very same Celtic people who'd sacked Rome in 390 BC. The Romans' fear of Celtic peoples, like the Gauls, was more than historical. It was also physical.
Partly the sheer size of the Celts. The Italians were a fairly small people, and compared to them, the Gauls, for example, were absolutely enormous, sort of 6-footers, that the Italians weren't used to. For example, we're told that Julius Caesar was tall for a Roman. He was only 5'6".
To the Romans, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek, such as the Celts, was looked down upon as a barbarian because the language sounded like sheep. Ba, ba.
The Romans have a very particular view of themselves, and that is to see themselves as people who've developed the powers of the mind to control the body. Barbarians, on the other hand, are people who are led by physical desire, sex and drugs and rock and roll. They don't have a proper education, so they go for the nearest thrill.
But the Celts that Caesar was fighting in Gaul were far from barbarians as we know the term. They lived in organized towns, like this reconstruction in France, and they were master ironworkers who probably invented the chainmail armor that the Romans adopted. And the Celts' artwork was anything but barbaric. It's still regarded as one of the great artistic traditions of Europe. As warriors, the so-called barbarians were no match for Caesar's well-trained legions. Celtic warriors did not fight as a unit. They fought for individual glory.
The big men liked to show up dressed in fancy, shiny armor, stand at the front, and engage in warfare that was no doubt fairly brutal, but was fairly small scale. They couldn't plan total war in the way that the Romans could plan. They didn't have fully trained legions. They didn't have logistic backup.
Also, the Celts were up against a brilliant commander in Julius Caesar. He was ambitious, hungry for victories, and used daring and original tactics.
He was noted for the speed and surprise of his movements, and he really brought those techniques to perfection in using his legions. On the other hand, he was a little reckless. Part of his daring, and he often got himself into terrible scrapes. But he was so quick and so perceptive of the enemy's intentions that he was always able to get himself out.
From the word go, he was prepared to adapt. I mean, coming up against the Germans for the first time in his first campaign, enormous numbers of cavalry, he had virtually none. No problem, he simply gets in horses and tells one legion, right, boys, you're all against the cavalry. Suddenly has 5,000 cavalry.
Caesar knew he asked a lot of his soldiers, and so he went out of his way to cultivate an intense loyalty from them.
He didn't ask them to do anything that he didn't do, and he often dismissed his bodyguard and had his horse led away and actually stood in the ranks with the troops. And his troops were very loyal to him.
Not surprisingly, these loyal soldiers were also becoming wealthy soldiers through booty and slaves. The spoils of war were often won through great brutality. Caesar himself boasted that his campaigns in Gaul left 1 million dead and 1 million enslaved.
Caesar just carried out what I've called actually a big game hunt. He took his legions back and forth across Gaul, slaughtering troops, pillaging towns, killing women, children. The Romans were terribly cruel on the Celts.
Defeated enemies were often made into slaves. Slavery was tremendously important to Rome. 40% of the Italian population were slaves, the same percentage as the American South before the Civil War.
Slaves are fundamental to Rome's war effort. Essentially, slaves free the Roman citizens to fight in the army. Without slavery, it would have been impossible for Rome so effectively to initiate these wars of conquest.
Caesar's wars of conquest went on for 9 years. He was the ultimate example of everything the Roman army had become in its first 500 years. Dedicated, ambitious, ruthless. And Caesar would not stop with foreign conquests. With his army behind him, he would conquer his enemies in Rome and take the title of dictator for life.
Ambition, conquest, lust, murder, and the power of unrivaled technology. These are the cornerstones in the foundation of the Roman Empire.
They were driven by a kind of collective cultural ego.
Rome's colossal building projects, stadiums, palaces,
It may have been the greatest army of all time.
Over 1,000 years after Rome's fall, the armies of the French Emperor Napoleon descend on the city. Napoleon's forces have already battled their way through Europe. To take Rome seems an afterthought. By this time, it's a backwater. But for Napoleon, it has an almost religious significance. He claims he's the spiritual descendant of the Roman emperors. He has himself painted wearing the Roman crown of laurels, as if Rome still rules the world. His troops march unopposed into the city. It's like walking into a ghost town. They find the frightened Romans huddling among the ruins of the ancient city. Crumbling palaces and arches still seem to echo the magnificent triumphs they were built to celebrate. Goats and cattle graze where thousands once thronged the streets. In 70 AD, when the Emperor Vespasian started building the massive Colosseum, Rome was 10 times larger than the city Napoleon found. Vespasian wanted a great theater for the gory spectacles Romans so loved. The scale of the Roman games, like the scale of Rome itself, was staggering. The Colosseum had seating for 45,000 and standing room for 20,000 more. In one series of games, 5,000 people and 11,000 animals were slaughtered. Nothing in Hollywood could compare with this gruesome splatterfest. The blood and brutality were all too real, and the Romans were addicted to it.
When he saw the blood, rather than turn away, he fixed his eyes on the scene and took in all its frenzy. He reveled in the wickedness of the fighting and grew intoxicated with the bloodshed. When he left the arena, he took with him a sick mind, which left him no peace until he came back again. St. Augustine.
They did get excited watching gladiators kill one another. I'm not denying that. But you know what? So do we.
I think, for example, of the brouhaha over Mike Tyson. Right. What Mike Tyson did when he bit, was it Evander Holyfield's ear? That would have been applauded in the Roman arena. That's great. That's what you're supposed to do. In fact, you're supposed to rip the ear off and march around the arena with it in your mouth. That's what you're supposed to do.
Rome's savagery was matched by its size. When the Colosseum was built, Rome was a city of 1 million people and growing. Not until London of the 19th century would a city approach this size again.
What I think you'd notice if a time traveler went back would be the smell, the noise, the dirt, the crowdedness. I think there'd be lots of beggars, lots of signs of sickness, disease, lots of small children. It'd be rather like Calcutta or Rio. Crowded modern town, very poor, with these monumental buildings in the center expressing the wealth and power, with signs of the if a time. What I think you'd notice if a time traveler went back would be the smell, the noise, the dirt, the crowdedness. I think there'd be lots of beggars, lots of signs of sickness, disease, lots of small children. It'd be rather like Calcutta or Rio. Crowded modern town, very poor, with these monumental buildings in the center expressing the wealth and power of the empire.
Traffic was terrible. Julius Caesar forbade wheeled traffic during the day so people could move around, which meant that at night all these carts started going on these stone streets, and it was so noisy that you couldn't sleep.
To manage the problems of organizing such a huge concentration of people, the Romans invented the science of urban planning. To manage the problems of organizing such a huge concentration of people, the Romans invented the science of urban planning. They invented cement, built gigantic public storehouses, and installed citywide sewage systems. But their greatest achievement was the water supply.
The aqueducts of Rome reached 60 and 70 miles into the hills to guarantee a continual flow of fresh water into the city. That flow of fresh water provided enough water, gallons per person per day, that was not equaled by the city of Rome until the 1950s.
Along with millions of gallons of water, Romans consumed a staggering 8,000 tons of grain weekly. Supertankers, each carrying 1,000 tons of grain, crisscrossed the Mediterranean. They were the largest ships built until the Atlantic steamers of the 19th century. The city of Rome was the heart of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. Never has the Western world been better organized or more united. In the year 100 AD, you could travel from Egypt to France on paved roads with only one currency and one passport in your pocket. And this vast, well-organized empire would muster the largest army the world had ever seen. Over 500,000 soldiers. Rome was the superpower of the ancient world. Later superpowers never stopped learning the lessons of its spectacular rise and fall. Napoleon was not alone in his obsession with Rome. 20 years before Napoleon marched into Rome, on the other side of the Atlantic, a group of men were designing a political system for their new country.
In designing the Constitution of these United States of America, we have at various times sought precedent in the history of that ancient republic and endeavored to draw lessons both from its leading ideas and from the tumult and factions which finally brought it low. Thomas Jefferson.
The American founding fathers spent most of their childhood and much of their adulthood reading the Latin classics. To the founders, the past was not something that was dead, it was something that was alive, especially the Roman past. It was alive with personal and social meaning. This was crucial, I think, to the American Revolution because they were doing something really unprecedented in this revolution, and yet they were able to feel that they were not the first. The basis of our political system, I think, lies in Rome.
The Western world grew up in Rome's shadow. Its legends, its laws, its institutions, and its language. Napoleon said, "The story of Rome is the story of the world." It's a story of great commanders and politicians. Men like Caesar, Augustus, Hadrian, and Constantine. But it's also a story of the poor who bore the brunt of their leaders' ambitions. It's a story of vast idealism and an equally vast greed for power. And finally, it's the story of Rome's spectacular fall and the chaos that followed. But behind all that are the stories of Rome's beginnings almost 3,000 years ago in the lush hills of central Italy. When the Mediterranean sailors of ancient Greece and Egypt looked west toward Italy, they stared into a great unknown. Equally the story of Rome's spectacular fall. Behind all that are the stories of Rome's beginnings almost 3,000 years ago in the lush hills of central Italy. When the Mediterranean sailors of ancient Greece and Egypt looked west toward Italy, they stared into a great unknown. It was 800 years before the birth of Christ, and Rome still didn't exist. But stories were told of mysterious peoples with strange, exotic customs and untold riches. The tales were irresistible. Setting off from the great civilized cities of the East like Athens and Tyre, adventurous Greek traders sailed west into uncharted seas. Navigating by the stars, without instruments, they began to explore a remote and little-known peninsula of the Western Mediterranean. They called it Hesperia, the land of the evening sun.
Well, in the 8th century BC, time of westward expansion, Phoenicians going west, Greeks going west, founding colonies. Well, when the Greeks sailed into Italy, they found something they didn't expect, an advanced civilization already there.
Here in the hills of Tuscany, there were already walled cities. There were kings and high priests. There were skillful craftsmen who created a tender and sensuous art like no other in the Mediterranean. And there were traders ready to barter the finest gold and ironwork the ancient world had ever seen. Before Rome, there were the Etruscans. They taught the Romans everything, but left no written records.
Incredible. The Etruscans were some of the most amazing artisans that the West has ever seen. They worked in metal for sculpture. They worked in terracotta and life-size statues with these amazing, inviting expressions. Very warm. They're not cold and distant, but they're people that you want to meet.
The Etruscans lived in the fertile hills of Tuscany. But their real wealth lay underground, the richest deposits of iron ore, copper, and tin in the central Mediterranean. As early as 700 BC, they created shafts, tunnels, subterranean galleries, smelters and slag heaps so vast that 2,500 years later, Mussolini reprocessed them to produce weapons for World War II. Etruscans traded their metalwork as far afield as Syria, Portugal, and even Sweden. But above all, the Etruscans were famous for their open displays of affection between men and women. It shocked the ancient world.
The Greeks, who knew the Etruscans from very early on, before Rome was anything, before Rome was, saw that the Etruscan people gave a position to women that the Greeks certainly wouldn't. Not only were women part of the entire house, women reclined at banquets with men, which for a Greek was absolutely unthinkable.
It is no shame for the Etruscans to be seen having sexual experiences, for this too is normal there. It seems to be the local custom. Posidonius.
And they show no shame in sensuous acts. While the torches are still lit, servants bring in courtesans, sometimes even their own wives, and they all engage in lovemaking, publicly. Theopompus.
The Greeks and later the Romans loved to embroider scandalous stories about the decadence of the Etruscans. They were almost certainly untrue. But it is true that the Etruscans created memorable portraits of sensual pleasure. After the Etruscans, the idea of portraying such intimacy between men and women disappeared from Western art for almost 2,000 years. The change began with the Romans, who grew up in their shadow. The first Romans were primitive, tough backwoodsmen. They resented the Etruscans, but had everything to learn from them, including the darker sides of civilization. Like all ancient people, the Etruscans were rigidly divided by class. Brutal rituals enforced the power and prestige of the nobility. Etruscans staged games at the funerals of important men. The losers were killed. Their blood celebrated the prestige of the dead man and was an offering to his spirit. The wrestlers were slaves captured in warfare. Their lives were worth nothing. Only their deaths were significant. The practice of human sacrifice was common in the ancient world. The Etruscans were no exception. The blood of slaves and captives watered the ground at state rituals throughout the Mediterranean. Romans inherited the Etruscan taste for sacrificial blood. Gladiatorial combat was the Roman equivalent of these gory celebrations of power. Rome took everything from the Etruscans. Etruscan engineers showed them how to drain the marshes where Rome now stands and channel the water into underground sewers. Etruscan architects and builders laid out the Roman Forum as a public square in the 7th century BC. Though Romans owed everything to the Etruscans, they would one day turn on them, crush their beautiful cities, and defame their memory. It would be the first step on Rome's path to empire. Most of what we know about the birth of Rome comes from the work of one man, one of Rome's greatest historians, Livy. He lived in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, over 700 years after the city was founded. The glory of Rome was at its height, but Romans were already haunted by the specter of decline. The empire was emerging from decades of civil war. Bitterness and political intrigue were rampant. Decadence, greed, and profiteering were the order of the day. To men like Livy, raised on the Roman stoic virtues of valor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, it seemed the spirit of Rome was rotting.
I feel that indulgence has brought us, through every form of sensual excess, to be morbidly attracted to death in all its forms. Rome is at the dark dawning of an age in which we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them. Livy.
A cure was what Emperor Augustus was looking for. he cracked down on dissent and passed laws to punish immorality. He was determined to reform the empire and force a return to Roman family values. Bawdy poets like Ovid, who wrote The Art of Love, were banished to the Asian steppes. When his own daughter Julia was rumored to have slept with half the Senate, Augustus banished her as well.
Livy saw in Augustus, or in Octavian, a chance for the world to finally settle down and get back to business. What made Rome great to begin with? You got to go back and look. Who were the heroes of the past that made Rome the city she was?
I hope that history may be the best cure for a sick mind. At least it can remind us of what we once were and show us the depths to which we are now sinking.
Livy set out to write a brief history of early Rome, celebrating its glories and virtues, propaganda for the reforms of Augustus. What he had to go on were stories handed down over the centuries. They were a mixture of fact and legend.
I, for one, am looking forward to absorbing myself in antiquity, because I am so deeply tired of the modern world and all the troubles which torment it. Livy.
He believed Rome's mythological beginnings would reveal the stories of heroism and nobility Romans needed to hear. But the stories of Rome's origins were short on Stoic virtues and long on murder, rape, mayhem, and fratricide. To his dismay, Livy discovered they echoed the cruel realities of the Roman world of his own day. Legends told that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twins who were cast into the wilderness to die. But the boys were said to be saved by a she-wolf who suckled them. They grew up like savages in the woods. When they returned to found the city of Rome, they were filled with the simple, ferocious spirit of their wolf mother. According to legend, Romulus and Remus then led their people to the bend in the river Tiber, where she found them. There Rome was born. The year was 753 BC. But hardly had they founded the city than the two brothers quarreled over who should be king. It was left to the augurs to decide. Augurs were the priests of early Rome who divined the will of the gods. They studied the movements of birds, the weather, the entrails of sheep before making their pronouncements, known as the auguries. The augurs placed each brother on a hilltop, then waited. When birds flocked over Romulus, they knew he would be the first king of Rome. But Remus refused the augury, and the brothers fought. The first king of Rome, suckled by a wolf, bathed in his brother's blood, walked away furious and triumphant. It was a fitting augury for the bloodshed and strife that lay ahead.
The story about Romulus killing his twin brother at the moment of the founding of the city is a very old story. It's very, very remarkable that in the late Republic, the Romans were fighting civil wars, and of course, it didn't escape their notice that this seemed to be prefigured in the myth with Romulus killing his brother. They actually thought this was a sort of curse on them, that they were fated to destroy each other.
Well, the whole Roman psyche was based on violence. If you look at the foundation legends of Romulus and Remus, that's based on fratricide, right? One brother kills another to found a city. And from that point, it just escalates.
The violence of the early Romans, in fact and fiction, was born of desperation. In real life, shunned by neighboring tribes, Rome was forced to welcome outcasts, vagrants, and fugitives. And they lured their neighbors, the Sabines, to a ritual of peacemaking.
And they're all a pretty desperate lot. And Rome, the earliest community that is organized in that way, of course, is a place where no woman wants to go. So they haven't got any women, that's the first problem.
And so the Romans, Romulus in particular,
were wary, but accepted. As the festivities went on into the night, they grabbed the women and drove off the Sabine men, the ones they didn't kill. When painters of a later age portrayed the rape of the Sabine women, they imagined a classical city. They were wrong. The early Romans were primitive people struggling desperately to survive. The grim stories of the first Romans were as surprising to Livy as they are to us. They certainly didn't provide the role models he was looking for. His little book turned into one of the most monumental histories ever written. By the time he died in 17 AD, it had grown to 142 volumes, all written laboriously in wax. It had absorbed his entire life. Livy's Chronicle was the bestseller of its day. It was more successful than he could ever have hoped, but had no effect whatsoever on the moral chaos of empire. Even 142 books were no match for the influence of so much power. By now, Rome was a juggernaut whose momentum was unstoppable. Its course set by its mythic beginnings, whether fact or fiction. As it approached the 5th century BC, Rome was emerging from its legendary past into the real world of recorded history. It was now a thriving province of the Etruscan world, ruled by Etruscan kings. Primitive mud and thatch huts of Rome's early days had given way to a city of brick. Rome was absorbing people from surrounding lands and growing fast. Etruscan and Greek traders met in its busy streets. Phoenician boats from Sicily and North Africa sailed the Tiber. Wine, olives, and gold flooded into Italy. But Rome was still no different from many other prosperous cities of the Mediterranean. What first set it apart was not its capacity for trade or engineering or even warfare, but its ability to organize itself. The man who reshaped Roman society was an Etruscan king called Servius Tullius. There are no statues of him. We have no idea what he looked like. He never became as famous as later rulers of Rome, but his mark on history may be even greater. And yet, all Servius Tullius did was carry out history's first census.
Now, the census, the Roman census, are a very important institution. They would count the Roman citizens, all right, and list them, and then distribute them in their appropriate classes and political units and so on. The census was a kind of way of grading Roman citizens according to their status and prestige.
In the 6th century BC, the census detailed every Roman's obligations to the city, to obey its laws, pay taxes, and do military service. But much more important, it also gave them rights. This was the great innovation of Servius. In proportion to their contribution, Romans were given a say in how their city was run. Servius sowed the seeds of representational government. He organized an assembly to govern the city and gave it a name, the Senate. Finally, the census decreed that each of the city's social classes should contribute a group of soldiers for Rome's defense. They were called the legions, the fighting force that was going to put Rome's destiny back in its own hands and one day give it the world. The census didn't create equality or democracy. Rome remained a society governed by kings and nobles. Women had few rights. But it created a level of organization unheard of in the ancient world. No man did more for Rome than the Etruscan king Servius. His reforms laid the foundations for Rome's greatest achievement, the creation of the Republic. But like so many Roman rulers, he was brought down by treachery and intrigue. The king's own daughter wanted her husband Tarquin on the throne. Her henchmen knew how to get him there. And after they murdered the great king, power and paranoia went hand in hand in Rome. For almost 2 centuries, Rome had been ruled by Etruscan kings and Etruscan nobility. Under Servius, things had gone well. Under Tarquin, his successor, brutality and decadence flourished. While he and his relatives devoted themselves to pleasure, their henchmen carried out campaigns of political murder to remove any and all opposition. Romans were beginning to hate everything the Etruscans stood for. Resentment smoldered. A woman called Lucretia was the spark that would set it on fire. She was well loved and highly regarded for her kindness, beauty, and loyalty. She represented everything Romans felt they had and the Etruscans didn't: honor, virtue, bravery. One day, the king's son and some of his Etruscan nobles were on a journey away from Rome. Drunk, they decided to creep back into the city and spy on the most beautiful women to see what they were up to. They found their own wives as expected, partying. They found Lucretia hard at work.
Because this was an indication of good, virtuous, matronly behavior. Right? This is how Roman women should behave. They should not be sleeping with 300 members of the Senate, like Augustus's daughter allegedly did. They're not supposed to be poisoning members of their family, as Livia allegedly did. They're supposed to be producing cloth.
The next night, when he knew Lucretia's husband was away, King Tarquin's son crept back to her house alone. With a knife at her throat, he raped her and swore that if she breathed a word of it, he'd kill her. That would be unnecessary. The next day, too proud to live with her dishonor, Lucretia killed herself.
Ambition, conquest, lust, murder, and the power of unrivaled technology. These are the cornerstones in the foundation of the Roman Empire.
They were driven by a kind of collective cultural ego.
Rome's colossal building projects, stadiums, palaces, roads, aqueducts, span 3 continents and unleash the power and promise of the world's most advanced civilization.
These structures became symbols of that idea of Rome.
But while the Romans dominated the landscape with massive feats of construction, they were ultimately powerless to prevent their own self-destruction. March 15th, 44 BC. The most powerful man in the world lay lifeless on the floor of the Roman Senate. As a general, he nearly doubled the size of the Roman Empire. As a politician, he engineered a stunning rise to power. But now this battle-scarred warrior had been slain in Rome and by Romans. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar.
Caesar's rise to power was predicated on him wanting to have the best standing in the Roman state. He seemed to want too much power for himself. He did not share power with others, and this was what led directly to his assassination.
Decades earlier, as an ambitious young general, Caesar had recognized that the road to glory in Rome began on battlefields far from it. His thirst for military conquest would spawn the construction of one of Rome's most intimidating feats of engineering. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar is leading 8 Roman legions, a total of 40,000 men, north through Gaul, a Roman province encompassing modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland.
He wants to go to Germania, to Germany, and cross the Rhine because no Roman commander has yet done so. He wants to be as great a conqueror as Alexander the Great, and go beyond what is known.
The Rhine River lies on the edge of what is known. For centuries, it has been a buffer protecting Germanic tribes from Roman expansion. No previous army could cross it with the might needed for conquest. But Caesar,
commander,
encompassing modern north through Gaul, a Roman province encompassing modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland.
he wants to go to Germania, to Germany, and cross the Rhine because no Roman commander has yet done so. He wants to be as great a conqueror as Alexander the Great and go beyond what is known.
The Rhine River lies on the edge of what is known. For centuries, it has been a buffer protecting Germanic tribes from Roman expansion. No previous army could cross it with the might needed for conquest. But Caesar is unlike any previous warrior.
He could have gone by boat, but what is that for Julius Caesar to go by boat, man? Rowboat? You know, you gonna put 8 legions in a rowboat and row across? No, man, they gotta march across. They're gonna be on horseback.
Crossing the Rhine was a completely new engineering feat as far as its scope. The river is 1,000 feet across, possibly more, 25 to 30 feet deep, with unknown currents. Caesar and his engineers had to come up with a plan for a bridge that would be not only immensely strong, but immensely stable, and be large enough to be able to march a legion across.
The bridge
engineering feat as far
like any.
The river is 1,000 feet across, possibly more, 25 to 30 feet deep, with unknown currents. Caesar and his engineers had to come up with a plan for a bridge that would be not only immensely strong, but immensely stable, and be large enough to be able to march a legion across.
The bridge would need to be 4 football fields long and sustain the weight of 40,000 soldiers. Despite the Rhine's width, depth, and strong currents, Julius Caesar is determined to succeed.
To cross a river that size with a bridge is something which plays well with an audience back at home, but of course it's something that plays extremely well with the audience standing on the other side of the river, who are going to be awestruck when they see this happening.
With the speed and efficiency of a well-oiled machine, Caesar's soldiers methodically transform local timber into an expanding bridge. With every hour, an engineering miracle inches closer to the Rhine's elusive northern bank.
It's almost as if a spaceship were to come down nowadays, the size, let's say, of half of Manhattan, capable of with some magnetic device that will like lifting buildings up into the air. That would be a pretty frightening thing, something that we couldn't really grasp at all.
The foundation of the bridge was a series of wooden piles driven into the bedrock of the river. Each pile was 1.5 feet thick. Toward the middle of the bridge, they had to be up to 30 feet tall to reach from the surface to the bottom. By driving the piles in diagonally, the foundation of the bridge was a series of wooden piles driven into the bedrock of the river. Each pile was 1.5 feet thick. Toward the middle of the bridge, they had to be up to 30 feet tall to reach from the surface to the bottom. By driving the piles in diagonally, Caesar's engineers added extra stability to the bridge.
When they drove the pilings in at an angle and then connected them, in many ways they were doing what carpenters do when they build a sawhorse. With the legs angled, it utilizes forces to keep it from being pushed over and makes it a stable workspace.
The sloping pile gives them a lot more strength against the force of the river and flooding of the river and so on, but it's much more difficult to drive them into the riverbed than it is to drive a vertical pile. So they would have had to work very carefully with wooden frames to push them into the riverbed.
On the upstream side, the piles leaned in the direction of the current. 40 feet downstream, the corresponding piles leaned against the current. Each set of piles was joined by a long connecting beam 2 feet thick. Lengths of timber were then laid across the beams, and the surface was finished with tightly wrapped bundles of sticks. The design of the bridge itself was innovative, but what made this engineering feat even more astounding is the speed with which it was built. Just 10 days after ordering its construction, Caesar marched across his bridge and toward his destiny.
If we tried to do that today, we would never be able to build something like that in so few days with that kind of technology. We could match that feat today if we had thousands of loyal, sweating soldiers totally dedicated to Caesar and the objective of getting across that Rhine River to terrorize the Germans beyond.
Caesar had estimated the size of the Germanic forces at 430,000, more than 10 times the size of his own army. But when the Germans saw the Roman legions rolling over the Rhine, they quickly fled to higher ground. For the next 18 days, Caesar freely explored the territory north of the Rhine, encountering no resistance. Then he crossed back over his bridge and dismantled it, having made an unmistakable point.
It is symbolic of this. Rome can go anywhere. There's nothing going to hold Rome back. And to distill it even farther, Julius Caesar can go anywhere.
Caesar's bridge was an early indication of his single-minded ambition. A decade later, that ambition would propel him to unprecedented power, but it would also prove to be his downfall. When he was declared Rome's first dictator for life at the age of 55 in 44 BC, whispers of assassination began to echo through the halls of the Roman Senate.
He makes certain moves that suggest that he might want to have been worshipped as a god, that his ambition really goes so far beyond the limits of what the Romans themselves, and in particular Roman senators, felt to be acceptable, that he was assassinated.
In life, Julius Caesar forever altered Rome's political landscape. In death, he would embody both the potential and the peril of absolute power.
When Caesar was assassinated, there was no guarantee that anything would happen except that Rome would fall apart completely.
Caesar's reign was a major turning point in Rome's political history. His conquest of Gaul greatly expanded the reach of Roman influence. His consolidation of power marked the death of the Roman Republic, ruled by democratically elected senators and consuls, and the birth of an empire in which tyrannical emperors could rule with absolute authority. Some would use their power to build magnificent engineering marvels. The vanity power to build magnificent engineering marvels. The vanity, excess, and ignorance of others would push the empire to the brink of destruction. Through it all, Rome would grow into the most powerful and technologically advanced civilization the world had ever seen. Today, Rome is a 21st century city where the ancient and modern collide.
Anyone who's visited the city of Rome is immediately struck by this immense mixture of time periods spanning from prehistory all the way up through the modern age. And the wonderful thing about Rome is that you're living in the midst of the history of one of the greatest civilizations that's ever been a part of humanity's history.
Roman legend says the city was founded in 753 BC by Romulus and Remus, two brothers who were abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf. The two brothers set out to build their own city on the banks of the Tiber River. But a disagreement over who would rule it ended in murder. Remus was killed at the hands of Romulus, for whom the city of Rome is named. It would not be the last time bloodshed produced a new Roman ruler.
civil war actually is one of the very defining features of the growth of the Roman state. The story, the tradition of Romulus and Remus is one that reverberates and echoes throughout Roman history.
Initially, Rome was one of countless small kingdoms jockeying for power in central Italy. But unlike many of its neighbors, who were suspicious of outsiders, Rome was a safe haven for ambitious outcasts.
Romulus, he said, given the fact that we don't have any population, I'll create an asylum. I will create a sort of a free zone for anybody. Runaway slaves, brigands, pirates, whoever. Come and be part of this great idea, which is Rome. That's a very unique attitude. And said from the very beginning, it seemed that the Romans were very open.
This openness encouraged a free exchange of ideas. Among them were engineering theories imported from other cultures. By borrowing the technology of neighbors like the Etruscans, Rome expanded into a regional power.
The Romans had an extraordinary ability to take from a technological past and adapt it to their own purposes and to refine it and to improve upon it. They were able to take from these Etruscans the technology of road building, of moving water systems through tunnels, of building large, extraordinary walls, and produce something which was based on Etruscan technology.
The city's first major engineering achievement was the Cloaca Maxima, an extensive sewer system which still functions today 2,500 years after it was constructed. The Cloaca Maxima flushed runoff from Rome's city streets into the Tiber River. Engineers also used the sewer's underground pipeline to drain the marshland between Rome's hilltop villages. There they built the Forum, ancient Rome's downtown district.
The construction of the Cloaca Maxima is the key event in transforming Rome from a series of tribes living on disparate hills around a swampy marsh into kind of centralized, unified culture. The new Roman Forum that resulted from the draining of the Cloaca Maxima really allowed that culture to consolidate in one central place.
While Rome's culture was consolidating, the influence the city had over its neighbors began to grow. By the 4th century BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy, and its engineers were called on to develop a transportation infrastructure that would connect the expanding empire.
In antiquity, there were basically two modes of transportation. There was transportation through the countryside, either on horseback, but probably walking or in carts, or that there was travel by ship. The roads, as we understand them today, basically didn't exist before the Roman Empire.
That all changed in 312 BC, when the Via Appia was built. Rome's first national highway stretched 132 miles from the capital to its southern province of Campania. To plot the straightest and fastest route down the coast, Roman engineers used a specialized surveying instrument.
The Romans relied on the tool called a groma, which was a vertical pole that stood in the ground with a cross on the top, and you could sight along this cross to line up 2 points in a straight line. The big difference with to line up 2 points in a straight line. The big difference with Roman roads and modern roads is that the Romans couldn't survey a corner, so they were all dead straight, and then they would turn a sharp angle and then go dead straight in another direction. The challenge, of course, with building a dead straight road in any direction is that you come to hills and valleys and you have to cross them. So if they had to, then they would cut through the mountains in order to take the road straight through.
Once the ideal path was cleared, a broad trench was dug and filled in with sand and boulders to form a solid foundation. Next went a layer of gravel compacted with clay or mortar. The top surface was a layer of thick paving stones angled to allow the water to drain off to the side.
The roads were incredibly intimidating. You could look at a road and say, I wonder how long it takes to get a couple of legions, 10,000 guys down this road, you know, right into my backyard. I think I'll think twice about starting any nonsense with Rome.
By the time of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Rome controlled most of Western Europe and North Africa. It had defeated Carthage a century earlier, making it the Mediterranean world's lone superpower. The ideal path. Once the ideal path was cleared, a broad trench was dug and filled in with sand and boulders to form a solid foundation. Next went a layer of gravel compacted with clay or mortar. The top surface was a layer of thick paving stones angled to allow the water to drain off to the side.
The roads were incredibly intimidating. You could look at a road and say, I wonder how long it takes to get a couple of legions, 10,000 guys down this road, you know, right into my backyard.
Paving, gravel, compacted and boulders, the ideal path was cleared. Once the ideal path was cleared, a broad trench was dug and filled in with sand and boulders to form a solid foundation. Next went a layer of gravel compacted with clay or mortar. The top surface was a layer of thick paving stones angled to allow the water to drain off to the side.
The roads were incredibly intimidating. You could look at a road and say, I wonder how long it takes to get a couple of legions, 10,000 guys down this road, you know, right into my backyard. I think I'll think twice about starting any nonsense with Rome.